All right. I'm going to get this started right on time because I've got a lot of content to go through. So any late stragglers will miss the most important bits, which I put right in the beginning. So welcome. I'm Dan Liu. I work at Trello. And the thesis of almost all of my talks are that I did something very bad for a long time, and now I do it slightly better than I used to do it, and I would like to reveal how. So for the longest time, I've used styles and themes very incorrectly, and they drove me nuts. And here's just a kind of quick primer on what exactly are styles and themes and ways that you can abuse that system to make your life worse. So of course, the clicker doesn't work. There we go. So let's start off with styles first, because they're the simpler of the two in my mind. And it's a very simple concept. If you have a view with some attributes on it, you can take those attributes and extract them into a style. So on the top, you have this version with a background attribute applied directly to the view. On the bottom, you have this version where instead of referring to the background directly, it refers to a style, and then that style then has the same attribute defined in it. So why is this useful? This is just a very simple flattening of attributes into the view. The usefulness here is that then you can take this style and apply it to multiple views. And in particular, when you want a style is when you have what I like to refer to as multiple semantically identical views. That is to say that all of the views mean exactly the same thing. So I feel like the simplest example is using the calculator. You want all of the buttons on the calculator to look and feel exactly the same. You don't want to have to, if I want to change the color of the buttons, I don't want to have to go through and change 10 different buttons, like change the text color on all 10 of them. What I want to do is just have one style applied to all of them and then be able to change it in one spot. So to put it another way, what I want is for all of the style views to change at once whenever I change the attributes. So that's the key there, is I want everything to move in sync. By opposition, when not to style, and these are the things that I totally screwed up when I first started using styles, is first, single-use styles. So that's where you have a single style in one place, and or you're using it only for a single view. And when you're using it for just a single view, it doesn't really gain you that much, because you're not getting any reuse, and now when you read the code, it's harder to read. It's so easy to extract a style later that I just put that off until I actually need it. And then the second one, and this is the real biggie, is just when two views coincidentally happen to have the same attributes doesn't mean that you should reduce code duplication by using a style. So in these two views I've got here, they have the same text color and text color hint. So I think, great, I'm going to extract them into their own style. But the key here is that, as indicated by the ID, they mean two different things. One is supposed to be the title text, and one is supposed to be the body text of some layout. And what this does is it essentially locks both of them so that I can never change the style again. Because if I want the title to be a different color, that's suddenly going to accidentally affect the body. Or if I want the body to have a different text color hint, that's going to suddenly affect the title. And that's not what I want. And when you have this locking in system, suddenly your styles, instead of helping you out, reducing code duplication, just locks you in. Another way I like to think of this is in terms of just pure Java code. So imagine that I've got two constants. One is a number of columns. Let's say it's like the number of columns in a staggered grid view. And then on the other constant I have is, say, a number of retries on a network request, like the maximum number of times I'm going to try to reach the internet. So if I'm a genius programmer, I might say, all right, those things equal the same. They're the same number. So why don't I just create a third constant called num3 and use that instead? I have reduced the number of lines of code. And now this is dumb for two reasons. One is that 3 is already a constant. But this is a contrived example. But the second reason is, now these two things, which meant completely different, they had very different semantic meanings, are now linked to the same piece of code. So if I want to change the number of retries in my network requests, suddenly my staggered grid view is going to look completely different. So that doesn't make any sense. Why would you do it in Java code? Don't do it with styles either. So I was mentioning before, it's very easy to have this clicker not work exactly. It's very easy to extract style. So if you don't have a style, in Android Studio, there's this cool refactor menu. You can right-click on any view, and you go to refactor, extract style, and it brings up this dialog here. And the dialog lets you click on which attributes you want to extract, name the style, and then you can also use that launch use style where possible dialog, which means that it'll just go through your system and find all the other views that happen to be using the same attributes. Again, don't do it just coincidentally, but if you've decided, oh, I've got these 5 views and they all mean the same thing and I want to refactor it now, this is a quick way to do that. All right, style inheritance. So styles themselves don't have to have a single layer. They can have parents and children. And the child, it's very simple inheritance. The child inherits all of the attributes of the parent and can also override the attributes of the parent. So I'm not going to get too much into what you do with that. What I'm more going to get into is the 2 different ways that you can do this inheritance. So suppose I have this parent style. There's 2 ways. I like to call it implicit and explicit parenting. These aren't, I think, official names, but they're just what I've come up with. So an explicit child uses this parent attribute. And it's a second attribute on top of the name that points directly to which style you want. Alternatively, you can use an implicit child, and that's using this dot notation. And the dot doesn't just make things look pretty, it actually parents. So those 2 children actually mean exactly the same thing. They're just defined in 2 different ways. So then the interesting topic comes up, which is what happens in a custody battle. So what happens if we have 2 different parents, one called implicit and one called explicit, and we have a child that uses both? So who gets the child? Who gets custody? And we have 3 options here. And I want to see a show of hands. Who thinks that both of them will merge their attributes onto the child? All right, a few people. Who thinks the implicit parent gets the attributes? And who thinks the explicit parent gets all the attributes? All right, we've got a smart crowd here. It is the explicit parent that gets all of the attributes. So you have to be very careful here, because if you mix implicit and explicit parenting, only one of them actually wins. And that leads me to another sanity saver moment, which is just don't mix them, if at all possible, because it is with inheritance, oftentimes you do need to look up what the parent is directly, but this is intentionally misleading. Because say I give you this, you see this line of code, and I see a style widget.button.calculator. All right? When I'm looking at this, who do I think the parent is? I think that the parent is widget.button, because that's what it's indicating to me. But when I go to the style, it turns out it's actually something completely different. So it's not just that it's wrong, it's very misleading. And so if you were going to go and change, you might go and change widget.button, and suddenly none of the changes get adapted by widget.button.calculator. So there's 2 solutions around this. The first is, and this is what I use by far the most often, is that when you have an explicit parent, that implies that you should have a dotless child. So if you have to define the parent, which you often do when you're parenting Android OS styles, or you're parenting styles provided by something like a library like AppCompat, then the name of your style shouldn't have any dots in it. That keeps things nice and simple. The alternative is to fake it, which is you can have the dots, but just make sure that when you build things up, you duplicate all of the references, or you duplicate all of the parenting so that it lines up in the end. And this is essentially what the Android operating system, or the built-in Android styles and themes do all the time, as well as AppCompat. And this is in order to make your life easier, so that when you parent something, you're only having to parent one thing instead of doing some very complicated setup. But you can fake it if you need to. I'd much rather the first. Multiple styles. So in Android, just like in CSS, you could have multiple classes on a view, except actually you can't. You can only have one style per view. And it would be really great if you could have multiple styles on a single view, but you cannot. But there is one exception, which is text appearance. Text appearance is a second style that you can define for text view-based views, which allow you to affect a whole wide range of attributes that commonly apply just to the text portion of that view. So you can read this whole thing if you really want to, but it has the main highlights like text color and text color link and all, text size, text style. So then when you actually use it in action, you can define 2 styles, sort of. One style for the text appearance and one style for everything else. And by the way, the order of priority is that things defined in the text appearance have the least priority. Those can be overridden by things in the style, which can then be overridden by things defined just directly on the view itself. One important thing to note when using text appearance is that you always want to inherit. You always want to define a parent. So normally when you use a style attribute, it'll just, normally when you use styles, it'll just meld whatever attributes you define in with the defaults built into the view. The defaults built into text appearance are horrendous. So you'll get like a text size of 1 or something like that. So make sure that you define a parent which has all these nice defaults for you so that then you can just modify one small part of it. So I told you all of that so I could tell you about this, which is themes. Because themes are a grander idea on styles. Because styles are very local. They're very local to an individual view. Themes allow you to do a lot more. So what do they let you get away with? They let you write a whole lot of UX code at once. So instead of defining a single style and having to apply it manually to every view that you want to have it, you can do things like, I'm going to define the default color that my app is going to look like, and it'll just apply it to all the widgets on your system. So you get a lot more leverage using themes. You can set up defaults for everything. So all of the system has default looks and feels for all of the views, all the widgets. So for example, there is a button style that you can define and then change all of the buttons in one fell swoop. You can do things on an activity level. So with plain styles, you can only apply it to an individual view. With themes, you can apply it to things that go beyond the views that you're even interacting with. For example, like modifying the window background or modifying the status bar or navigation bar. You can configure a system created view, which is basically what I just said. And then you can also do theme swapping if you want. In other words, like have a light and a dark version of your app. I've personally never done this, so I'm not going to really cover that this much. But if you want to have theme swapping, you've pretty much got to use themes. So what is the difference then between themes and styles? Why did I include them in the same talk? Well, for one thing, they're exactly the same thing. Here's a style and here's a theme. And as you can see, they're both using the exact same system. They're both using the style tag. They're both using the item tag. And they're both defining name and then some attribute inside of there. So then what is the difference then? The difference is how Android uses these. With styles, they're just basically flattening them into the attribute set that's sent to the view constructor. With themes, it has a completely different scope. It's applying it to an entire activity, or it's applying it to a set of views. And as a result of that, they have dramatically different attributes. So in the case of my style here, I've got a background defined, which makes a lot of sense on an individual view. But if I define background and I pass that to a theme, that doesn't really make much sense, because the question then becomes background of what? In themes, there is a whole bunch of backgrounds. It could be the window background. It could be the status bar background. It could be the background of just buttons. I don't know. Versus the theme has attributes that target things that you can't even target with views. So in this case, the status bar color, I don't even have control over that view. So the system, they both define a set of attributes. They just use them in different ways. So another piece of advice to keep yourself sane is just do not mix up styles and themes. They can occasionally refer to each other. A theme can define default widget styles in it, and a style can refer to attributes defined in a theme. That's fine. But in terms of inheritance, that makes no sense. They don't even use the same set of attributes. Why would you want to have your widget inherit from a theme? It just is confusing and doesn't make any sense. In the same way, if you try to apply a theme to a view, that's a little weird, unless you're using the new view theming. So how do you actually apply these? There's kind of two different ways. You can apply it in the manifest. And in the manifest, you can either apply it to the application or you can apply it to the individual activity. Now, if you apply it to the application, what's happening is that it's applying that theme to every activity by default. If you define it in the activity, it overrides whatever happened in the application. So you either get one or the other. There's no cascading between the two. And then, so that used to be the only way to really do themes, at least in XML. And then now in Lollipop, they've introduced view theming, which is a huge savior and makes my life so much easier, where you can define a theme on the view itself, and then that theme takes over for that view and all of its children. Now, why is this helpful? It's because there's all sorts of things where you want just a subpart of your app to look different than the rest. If you remember from the Holo days, there was a holo.light.dark action bar. And the reason they did that is because there was no way to theme just the action bar portion itself. You have to include the idea of a dark action bar as part of the entire theme. Now that you can have view-level theming, you can define, OK, I've got my toolbar, and I can just define it on whatever. And in fact, there's also a pop-up theme attribute you can use to define a different theme for the things that are pop-ups, like the overflow menu when you click on that. If you want to define the background of that, for example, that's something you can now define differently. So I learned something recently, which was that if you have a blank slide, then people pay more attention to you. So I decided to try throwing a blank slide here. And now I'm going to say, probably the biggest piece of advice I have here is to use AppCompat. It will make your life so much easier. And I think people have this misconception that AppCompat is all about fragments. You do not have to use fragments when you're using AppCompat. There are a lot of other benefits that you get from using AppCompat in terms of theming. First of all, it gives you the ability to have material theme on all of your devices. So most people these days are supporting multiple different OS themes, essentially, because they're supporting 4.x, which had the Holo theme, and they're supporting 5.x, which had Material. And if you're really a masochist, you can support all the way back to Gingerbread or something like that. But the real problem there is that now you've multiplied every problem that you have. Every time you have to define something in one theme, you have to define it like 2 or 3 times. It's a lot easier just to have Material applied to your entire application. And AppCompat really helps you get to there. It also provides a bunch of baseline themes and styles. So a lot of the times what you want to do is take a style or a theme and then modify it or tweak it just ever so slightly. You don't want to have to redefine every attribute yourself, because that would be a huge mess. And again, if you're dealing with Material and Holo and Gingerbread, then that's a lot of extra work. Whereas with AppCompat, it provides a single style that you can change and modify slightly. It enables view theming prior to Lollipop. So one thing I really hate going to presentations is when someone's like, check out this new feature that's in the latest API that was released, and you can't use it for 4 years. With AppCompat, you can use view theming. Yay! So like I said, that thing like saves me, so I love it. And there's more things that I'll go over in a bit. So in theming, what I was saying, they're just attribute sets. What are the different types of attributes you can apply? So I'm going to go over a quick overview of the different attributes that are contained within themes. So one level is window-level attributes. What I like to think of as window-level attributes. So these are things that apply to like the entire window itself in your activity. So these are things like the window's background, the status bar color, and whether or not it's full screen. These are all going to be just a slice. This is clearly not a comprehensive review of every attribute, unless you really want me to bore you for the next 21 minutes. And this example doesn't make any sense either, because why would you care about status bar color if it was full screen? Ignore that. Anyway, so you get these window-level attributes. Kind of new also in Lollipop, and again, backported with AppCompat, is the ability to use colors to style all of your widgets. So prior to these color attributes existing, if you wanted to style, say, like all of your buttons, you were having to cut a whole bunch of assets for a whole bunch of 9 patches to tint all of your buttons. And that really sucked. It was a lot of work, especially when design is like, I don't like the shade that we gave you last week. Let's try a new shade. And suddenly they have to cut 64 new button assets for you. Now you can just define a few attributes like color primary or color primary dark, and then it'll automatically tint all of the widgets for you. This is the picture here shown is the one from the Android documentation. Don't let it fool you. There aren't just like 5 different colors that you can use. There's actually like 24 of them or something, which I'll go over later. You can define default styles. So on the top of this, you can see like there's a button style defined here. So instead of using the built-in button style, I can say I want my own button style. And I want this to automatically apply to all button widgets. So that's really handy. Spinner item style below that is useful because suppose that you're referencing the built-in layouts that Android provides. Like Android provides these things like a one-line spinner item drop-down thing, whatever. If you can use those, but the normal problem is like, oh, I've used it, but it doesn't look anything like the rest of my app looks like. Well, actually, you can use these things like spinner-atom style to make it look like the rest of your app, and then you have to write less layout code. And then along the same lines as button style, you can also define default text appearances that are applied in various places around your application. And again, it's great if you're using AppCompat or something like that in this case, because if you want to define your own button style where all you're tweaking is, say, like the margins a little bit or the padding a little bit, again, you can parent that and then use it here. You can define attributes that are just referenced directly in code somewhere. So one of my favorites is selectable item background. And you can refer to this whenever you want to see, like, for example, when you click on a list view row. Like, on newer versions of Android, you get that nice little ripple effect. On older versions of Android, it's just kind of a flat color because it can't do ripples. But in your code, you can refer to, using this question mark attribute / notation, that attribute. And there are a few advantages there. One is that then the theme can define different values for different situations. But also now, you can change all of that in the theme at once. So if I decide I want a different selectable item background, I can just change it in the theme, and suddenly my whole entire code base is different. And so actually, people should be using these question mark attribute things more often, really. Something you might have been noticing going through this is that I've sometimes been prefixing things with Android : and sometimes not. And the reason is because when it's an official Android attribute, then you use Android : those are the things that are included in the OS resources. But the problem is that you often run into this issue where this is like v21 only. Color primary was defined in Lollipop. So what happens in AppCompat is that it actually defines all of its own versions of these attributes again. But now that it's defined it, it's not part of the official OS resources, so it just has its own. It doesn't have that prefix to it. And the lazy way to figure out which one is which is to just leave off the Android : and see if it works, because your app won't compile if it doesn't. So that's the really lazy way of doing it. Otherwise, if you want to do it the not lazy way, you could open up AppCompat's attributes XML file and actually read through it. So finding attributes, I went over kind of like what the attributes can do. And you might be like, all right, that's really cool, but how do I actually know where these attributes live? How do I figure out like what attribute changes the buttons? And the unfortunate thing is that this is by far the most difficult part of theming, at least in my mind, because there are tons and tons and tons of attributes. And then to add on top of that, anyone can create attributes and add to your situation and make it even worse. Anyone can define attributes. And then even worse than that, anyone can use attributes at any time in any piece of the code. They can use it in XML. They can use it in the Java code. So there isn't really like one consistent listing of like all the attributes that you can get out there. But I can give you a few hints as to how to track this down. And all of it involves searching through source code. So if you haven't like downloaded the Android source code, you probably should. If you're looking for where attributes are used in XML, look for that question mark attribute. Or if it's an official like Android resource, the question mark Android : attribute. And so that's how to find out where the attributes are used in XML. Sometimes you grab the attribute individually. The attribute, by the way, the theme, by the way, is stored in the context. So you grab the theme out of the context, and then you can see individual attributes being used there. And then in views actually grab a whole bunch of attributes at once. So what you want to look for is this method called obtain styled attributes. And that essentially is a way of resolving multiple attributes at once. And it returns this thing called a typed array. Then what you want to look at is the typed array. Investigate what things are being withdrawn in the typed array. And the first part is which attributes are being referred to. And then the second thing is the default, which is very useful to know because maybe the attribute isn't defined at all, and it's just relying on this fallback value. One trick that I use a lot involves all of the color theming. So like I often have this problem where I'm like, what color is that thing? So I'm looking at this screen, and I'm like, there are something like a dozen text colors that you can define in the application. Seriously. What I've done at one point, and I still use it today, is set up this debug color theme. So what it essentially does is I went through and looked for all of the different colors you could find to define, and then define them all something unique. Something unique, and it makes your app look really, really ugly. But now you can launch something like, say, the digital color meter, and just move your mouse over your emulator or something like that, or the screenshot, and you can see the hex value of what's there. So that's a very quick way for me to go back to the theme and figure out, oh, it's text color primary that's causing this thing to be this color. And now the color might not be exact because of anti-aliasing or other graphical things, but you'll get within the ballpark there. Another handy tool that I think not too many people know about is some of the theme things that have been added recently to Hierarchy Viewer. Now note that this, for some reason, only seems to work on the standalone Hierarchy Viewer. If you get to Hierarchy Viewer through Android Studio, some of these things aren't available. I don't know why. But one thing is you can click on a view, and you can actually see this theme values here. And so you can see which themes being applied to that individual view. And it can actually be multiple themes because in the case of view theming, oftentimes you're using what's known as a theme overlay. So you're not clobbering the entire theme. You're just adding a few attributes on top of it. Another cool thing they've just added recently is this dump theme button. And you can click that, and what you get is this little dialog. And the dialog shows you what is currently in the theme. The only drawback is that it only shows you the official Android attributes that are in the theme, but still useful when you're trying to do all of this stuff. So I've gotten to the point now where I want to talk about my recipe for sanity. So this is like, we get to this point of the talk, great. I haven't taken way too much time, and I can give you kind of like a basic outline for how I attack styles and themes on Android before I get into some more advanced things. So the first piece of advice, use AppCompat, blank slide. Second piece of advice, try to modify the theme first whenever you're doing something. Instead of trying to slap an attribute on the view itself or extracting something into a style, if you can modify it in the theme and have it affect things there, that's all the better, because then you're affecting your entire app instead of doing it on a very localized part. You get much more leverage. Likewise, what you should be doing in code is referencing theme attributes whenever you can. So as you learn about as you work more with themes and you learn more theme attributes that exist, things like selectable item background, instead of referring to things directly, you should be referring to things in the theme. And again, then when you change things in the theme, it'll change everywhere in your code. And it'll be a lot easier to have a lot of leverage with a little bit of code. The next thing is apply themes to views when necessary. And again, I just want to grind in that this does exist now, because it's a relatively new thing, but I found it very handy from time to time. And then finally, use styles wisely. Like I said, don't be extracting styles just because a few views coincidentally happen to have the same attributes. All right, so that's it for the sane parts. Let's go into some of the more insane parts about theming and styling. So let's mess around with resource qualifiers. So that's those lovely things where you have the dashes, and then based on your device configuration, it'll select different resources from the system. So you can very easily abuse the system to do cool things with styles and themes. A simple version of this, and I actually highly recommend this, is you can define a resource, say like a color, and in this case I've defined BG background of a window, and it's going to, for whatever twisted reason, by default it's going to be one color, and then on Lollipop and above it's going to be a different color. Now in my theme, or in a style, I can reference that color directly, and it'll switch just depending on the device configuration. So this is a great way to reduce duplication, because otherwise you might need like multiple styles or themes to define if you want to use two different themes that are very vaguely the same but in different configurations, you don't have to do that. You can do that just in the same theme. This can get a little more complicated if you abuse this with inheritance. So suppose I've got this theme that I'm going to call base toolbar. And the reason I've got base toolbar is because Lint is yelling at me that elevation only exists on 21+. And so by default, it has no attributes in it. And then on 21+, I'm going to have an elevation applied to it. And then I can define my actual use toolbar. And it will actually trace through the inheritance and pick the correct parent when using the theme. So another way to look at this is to think of it as like a triangle. So I've got these two base themes that have modifications based on the qualifiers that I've given to it. But then in the end, what you actually end up using is the child of both of them. And then this can get infinitely more complicated. You can go another level. You can have a Qualifier Diamond. So now you can have a base theme, which defines attributes that everyone's going to get. Then have a layer where it splits. So then each of these have the parent of theme, but then they have their own qualifier-specific changes. And then at the bottom of that, you can decide on what to use. And you can do this for as many qualifications as you want, and it gets very complicated very quickly. It's sometimes necessary. If you look through AppCompat source code, which you will probably end up having to dive through at some point while working with styles and themes, and you're using AppCompat, there's actually a README that you can find in the source code that defines how their inheritance system works. Because it's 4 layers deep. There are 4 layers of AppCompat inheritance, and they have to document it because it's so complicated. But that's why they suffer for us. So that's their suffering. We get to use their simple baseline styles and themes as a result. Another really cool thing you can use are custom attributes. So you're not limited to the attributes that are provided by the system. You can write your own. So it's very simple. You just create an attribute value, and then you define a format for it. So that's the type of value that's inserted inside of that attribute. So in this case, I'm going to say a dimension. And then in your theme, you can then apply a value directly to that attribute. And this is essentially what you're doing when you're using something like AppCompat and then defining values for it. And then in your code, you can refer to whatever attribute you came up with. So this is really cool. I think this is especially important if you're going to be doing something like theme swapping. It gets complicated quickly because you're adding a layer of indirection to all of your code. It can be necessary for what you're going for, but sometimes I like a little more sanity, and I like being able to look at my code and see exactly what it's doing instead of having to trace through the themes. Anyways, so I finished actually a bit earlier than I thought I would. So I have time for questions if you'd like. You can find me on Twitter or Google+ or our website, and then there's the link to that debug color theme if anyone wants help with that. So does anyone? Oh. Does anyone have any questions?
Is there a situation where you're going to have both the attribute and the Android colon attribute?
I don't quite understand.
So AppCompat, you drop the Android colon prefix. Is there ever
Oh. Yeah, so the question is whether so if you're using AppCompat, like I was mentioning, sometimes you drop the prefix from it. And the question is, would there ever be a case where you need to define, say, both Android colon color primary and color primary? And the answer is generally no, because what AppCompat does internally is it takes the attributes that it knows and then applies it to the Android colon version for you, so that when you're on those later platforms, it also knows about those attributes. So the question is, when do you use the question mark versus the at? Use the at to refer directly to a resource, and use the question mark when you're referring to an attribute in a theme. I'm going to go all the way over there. Can you style Spinner from the Facebook SDK? I think that you could define a base Spinner style, but Facebook could do things to prevent you from actually applying it to their Spinner. It really depends on how they've set up their SDK. So I don't know. Sorry, I didn't quite hear. Could you? Yes and no. So they just introduced this in the newest tooling. You can create this hidden.xml, and then you can define, or is it hidden or public? I forget whether it's a positive or negative. You can look this up online later. But basically, you can define the set of attributes that you want to be public. And so then when you go into autocomplete in your IDE, it won't show, in Android Studio, it won't show those attributes that you haven't purposely revealed. So that's the yes part. The no part is everyone can still access all the other attributes. They're just hidden now. So there's no way to make it private such that someone can't access it anymore. Yes, I mean, you can write your code to be purposefully angry against styles and themes, and like you can write your custom views such that they don't ever like even obtain style attributes and just do whatever the hell they want. That's not a problem. I think it's kind of mean. Sorry, you have to speak up a little. Didn't quite hear. You're talking about theme.getDrawable? Oh yeah, because now they have drawable theming, because you can like tint drawables. That's something I didn't include because that isn't backported. So I don't really. I use more like my own color filter tinting or AppCompat's tinting to get that sort of effect. So that's something I'll worry about 4 years from now when I can use that SDK. If we have time, I have an old version of these slides which had more in it. And I can go to that, because I thought I was going to have so little time, and I ended up with more time. All right, so this is going to be a weird, where I had question and answer, and now I'm going to go over something quickly because I got another 4 minutes. So here we go. Suppose you want to have dynamic code, which, like I said, I wasn't going to go over too much because I don't really do theme swapping in code. This is more stuff that I've read about, and I hate when people get up on stage and talk about things they haven't actually used. I haven't actually used this stuff. So I'm just going to give you that big caveat at the front of all of this. But you can define, you can do a bunch of dynamic styles and themes in code if you want. I think kind of a little if you're a masochist. But you can get a dynamic text appearance. This is the easiest of all of them, because you can just call set text appearance and your text changes. You can get dynamic styles in your code as well. The issue is that with styles and themes, they're all applied on in the constructor. So it's not like you can take a view and apply a style to it after the fact, because all of the code that's reading the things in the style happened in the constructor. So really, if you're going to do dynamic theming or dynamic styling of views, you need to do it in the actual constructor itself. So to go through it quickly, like the attribute set, these are the attributes passed in, and from the view, the default style attribute is this really, really complicated thing, because you would think that this would be where you could pass in the style that you want to have applied, but no. That's where you pass in the attribute that points to the style that you want to apply by default. So for example, button style, that's something you pass in there. And then this last one is what you would expect it to be, the fallback style to go towards, but it only exists in Lollipop and beyond. So you can't really use that one too much. But one thing you can, one easier way than trying to attack this directly is to attack it indirectly and go against the context. Because like I said earlier, the context is where the theme comes from. So because the context carries the theme, you can use this cool class called the context theme wrapper to override parts of the theme. So you just take your base context, and then you can apply a theme on top of it. And then if you use that context theme wrapper in, say, a layout inflator, then all the views inflated in that are going to use that new theme. Or if you use it in a view constructor, it's going to use that new theme when it's inflated. And in fact, this is how, if you look internally, how AppCompat does view theming pre-Lollipop. It's just using a bunch of context theme wrappers. And then lastly, if you want to set the theme for the entire activity, there's a method called activity.setTheme. But the thing that's tricky about it is, again, this only really works if you call it before everything's constructed. So if you call setTheme after setContentView, or if you call it before setContentView, you're great. But if you call it after setContentView, nothing happens, really. So the trick that I was reading about online was if you try to call it after setContentView, then you have to basically force a restart of your activity. Anyways, ta-da! Those are like the lost levels, like the Mario lost levels of this talk. And I'll just put this back up in case anyone wants that link again. And that's pretty much my time. So thank you very much for listening.